If the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses and is not a fabrication from later imposters, then they should be able to get most of their facts right about that time period. In other words, in telling of the history and ministry of Jesus and the apostles, the author should be able to paint Jesus in the correct culture, region, and with other historical figures. So they should get the names of towns, rulers, cultural aspects, geography, and customs correct. Like, for example, if someone from the year 3000 discovered a book about the history of our time, to know whether it was written by an authentic eyewitness of this culture and not an imposter from a few centuries later, the author should be able to get several facts right. Like they should not mix up the order of presidents, place cities in the wrong state, or ascribe customs from the 1800s to the 21st century. In the same way, if the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses of the ministry of Jesus from 1st century Judea, they should get their facts correct about the region and culture. Likewise, the broad historical facts in the Gospels should be confirmed by other historical sources. And when we look at the evidence, this is exactly what we see. We find multiple secular sources attesting to the life and ministry of Jesus, confirmation in archaeological finds, and how the New Testament perfectly coheres with ancient history. Starting with the first one, we actually have 7 sources outside of the New Testament which mention the existence of Jesus. 3 major ones go even further. Tacitus, writing around 100 AD, says that Rome suffered a great fire in 64 AD, and many blame the Emperor Nero. To get rid of the rumors, Tacitus says, "Hence to suppress the rumors, he falsely charged with the guilt, and punished with the most exquisite tortures, the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius." As you can see, Tacitus is a hostile witness, which means his testimony meets the criteria of embarrassment, and he confirms what the New Testament says, that Jesus existed, that he was put to death, and by Pontius Pilate, was ruling in Judea under Emperor Tiberius. So Tacitus attests to 5 facts that align with the accounts in the New Testament. Another historian by the name of Josephus says of Christ, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive, again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day." Now the odd thing about this passage is Josephus was a Jew, not a Christian, yet he says Jesus was the Christ and confirms the resurrection. Because of this, scholars agree this passage has been interpolated, which means a later Christian scribe doctored it. However, that doesn't mean the entire passage is a fraud, and in fact most scholars think it is original and just slightly doctored. And fortunately we have textual evidence to confirm this. In 1971, an Arabic version of this passage from Josephus was found, and it reads like this. "At this time there was a wise man, who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders." So as I said, most scholars accept this passage was interpolated, and was originally more like what is found in the Arabic manuscript. Josephus also confirms in other sections that the brother of Jesus was James, and that John the Baptist was beheaded by Herod Antipas. Therefore, Josephus confirms New Testament facts that Jesus existed, he was a good and moral teacher, that many people followed him, he was put to death by Pilate by crucifixion. After his death, his disciples believe he appeared to them. They continued to preach his message. James was his brother. John the Baptist existed and was put to death by Herod Antipas. The Babylonian Talmud says, "On the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshua, and an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days saying, 'He is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead in his behalf.' But not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of Passover." The Talmud confirms the Jews wanted to stone Jesus, that he was crucified around Passover, and that he led many Jews away from the religious authorities. There is also an implication a trial happened, and the Talmud confirms Jesus was believed to be a miracle worker by accusing him of sorcery. This meets the criteria of embarrassment, since they have to admit it was believed Jesus had some supernatural power, but accuse it of coming from an evil source. This is why most historians accept Jesus was believed to be a miracle worker. As Graham Twelftree says, there is now almost unanimous agreement among Jesus questers that the historical Jesus performed mighty works. Even the Jesus Seminar lists among their basic facts about Jesus that he was a charismatic healer and exorcist. Thus we have several facts from these three sources, which confirm the broad historical facts of the New Testament. Finally, there is evidence in a citation from Africanus that the historians Pelagian and Thallus mention the period of darkness that happened around the time of Christ's death. He says, Thallus, in the third book of his Histories, explains away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun unreasonably. Pelagian appears to have said, during the time of Tiberius Caesar, an eclipse of the sun occurred during the full moon. Therefore, we have extra-biblical sources for the period of darkness in the New Testament. And also, we have a large amount of facts in the New Testament confirmed by other sources. The second section of external evidence comes from archaeological finds. The majority of what we find in archaeology confirms the biblical account, backing up the claim the New Testament is reliable.
But by and large, 85 to 90% of the discoveries being made in any land of the biblical world today almost immediately agrees with the biblical record. You can quarrel over the 10 or 15% if you want, but most of the archaeological discoveries affirm the biblical record.
There is so much data it would be impossible to go over it all. However, there are important finds we should mention. In the 1800s, several skeptics doubted the existence of Pilate, but in 1961 an inscription was found in Caesarea, which reads, "To Tiberius Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea," confirming the historical existence of Pilate, and that he was ruling in Judea under Tiberius, as Luke records. Skeptics also used to say Luke hadn't a clue what he was talking about, because he records Licinius was the tetrarch of Abilene under Tiberius. But we know from history Licinius lived earlier than that as tetrarch of Clausus. However, an inscription discovered at Albia, dating to the time of Tiberius, names Licinius as tetrarch, just as Luke had written. There were in fact two government officials named Licinius, and Luke was correct all along. In fact, we discovered archaeological evidence for many of the rulers Luke mentions, like Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Gallio the proconsul of Achaia from Acts 18. Many figures mentioned in the New Testament have been discovered in archaeology, such as Erastus, the treasurer at Corinth, mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans. In 1941, more ossuaries were discovered, one bearing the name Alexandros, son of Simon, and the ossuaries may contain a misspelling of Cyrenian. If so, this would be another historical figure mentioned in the New Testament. Even closer to Jesus, in Hierapolis, archaeologists believe they have found the lost tomb of Philip the Apostle. However, a major discovery came recently, when the family tomb of Caiaphas was discovered, confirming his existence as well. We also have discovered archaeological evidence of Bethlehem and Nazareth, despite them being small towns, as well as Capernaum. Also in Capernaum, we found evidence of a magnificent synagogue and a Roman presence, just as the New Testament testifies. In Jerusalem, we have found archaeological evidence for the remains of a pool of Bethesda and a pool of Siloam. We've also found a Galilean fishing boat, which perfectly fits the description in the New Testament. Again, there's so much to go over, it would be impossible to mention it all here.